everyone, it's day 68 of the Vendée Globe. The leaders are off the coast of Brazil near SiFi, starting to line themselves up for the doldrums. So it's a good time to have a close look at what lies ahead. Joining me today to have a closer look at the weather is multiple ocean race navigator Simon Fisher, known to most of us as SiFi. SiFi's completed in the last 5 Volvo Ocean Races and was the winning navigator in the 2014-15 edition with AbuDhabi Ocean Racing. He's now part of the IMOCA team, 11th Hour Racing, that acquired the former Hugo Boss that finished second in the Vendée Globe, and has been training and preparing to launch their new IMOCA 60 in the up-and-coming ocean race round Europe later this year. So let's bring him in and say welcome, SiFi. How you doing?
Hey Conrad, thanks very much for having me on. It's good to see you.
That's a pleasure. I can imagine you're following this race pretty closely because of obviously your involvement with the IMOCA class.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's certainly and at the beginning of the race, I think I was glued to every update and running every route and looking at everything. And from a team perspective, we're really trying to get as much information as we can about the different boats and the different foils and the choices they've made. Obviously, it's in an ideal world, we'd like to see all the new boats racing full on all the way around. But we all know it is a race of attrition, so some guys have fallen away. So it's been a shame for the purposes of data collection. But no, it's been a great race.
Thankfully, in some ways, this has been less of a race of attrition than perhaps in previous editions. There's still, some boats in there, albeit, without, some broken foils and some damage and so on. You know this stretch of water pretty well. I can imagine. It's pretty tactical. Who first of all, who's your money on? If we look at the sort of the lead group, which we've got 6 or 7 boats all within 100 miles of each other, which is pretty unusual at this stage. Who do you fancy at this stage?
Yeah, it's looking really interesting now. Obviously, the last few days have been really difficult, and it is always kind of getting up to the trade winds is always tricky. And I mean, I've always done it leaving from somewhere in Brazil, be it Rio or Itajaí or one of those places. But it's always those days until you get to the really good trade winds is difficult. It's always generally quite light. It can actually be really quite squally, and you can kind of grind out a bit of a lead and then stop for an hour and watch everyone go whistling by. It certainly happened to us a few times. But I think now they're going to get to sort of slightly better trades, although there's not going to be a great deal of wind speed. I mean, I think at the moment they're just kind of getting to where the wind diverges sort of around the easternmost point of Africa, so there's not going to be a great deal of wind. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the foiling boats can really sort of use the power of their foils, and if there's enough wind to do that. And then and if there's not, I guess the non-foilers are still looking good. And then obviously we know that there's a few boats sort of in the top group there that have sustained some foil damage and probably not peak efficiency. So I think it's going to be really fascinating to just see how they get on and who's able to sail fast and who can get the most out of their boat. And so I think we've seen Apivia be strong all the way around, and obviously, but they've had some issues linked out. Thomas Ruan's had a few issues and is a bit compromised. But actually, one interesting one to watch now is Boris Herman with 2 fully working new generation foils. So I think everyone's looking at him, and I know, having spoken with the team this morning, that everyone in France is following him quite closely as well at the moment.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of sea state with these foils. So as the boats now cross through into the doldrums, they're going to be getting into the trades, on a fairly tightish angle. How efficient are these foils on that stretch? Albeit if it's quite choppy, quite bumpy, can they deploy them fully on this next leg?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think the amazing thing with these foils is they do start working on quite a tight angle. There's the potential in the boat to sail very fast at some very tight angles, as we sort of certainly found out with our testing with the old Hugo Boss. The question then becomes, can the actual boat take it and continue to take it, and can the crew take it? I mean, we've definitely explored the limits a little ourselves.
Yeah.
We did a transatlantic last year, and it was the majority of the angles were inside, or if not all of the wind angles were inside 90, but it didn't stop us topping 30 knots. So you get an idea of the potential with these foils. But yeah, the hard thing is extracting as much speed as possible, but keeping everything one pace, not being too hard on the gear, not being too hard on the people. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and it's a question of the sea state kind of limits how much of that potential you can get out, and maybe for short periods you can push hard in the worst sea state. But yeah, what you don't want to have to do is then break something and then slow down, which suddenly becomes quite easy to do. So it's a really delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And that's really tricky if you're on your own.
So when you're looking at the routing for these boats in the North Atlantic, how much sort of adjustment do you allow in the polars for sea state?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think they can sound in pretty good performance as long as the sea state isn't too heinous. I mean, one of the interesting things is it's going to be a really interesting challenge as we get into crude racing and in a situation where you are pushing really hard all the time, is how do you actually accurately predict the sea state? Because actually things can change really, really quickly. The sea state can always change very rapidly, and that has actually a very big effect on the performance. So how we sort of manage the routing using wave models or wind models and then sort of keep constantly updating it, it's actually quite a challenge. So that's probably one of the sort of biggest things we've got to get our heads around.
Would you say on that point then, would you say that, wave models are going to become, a much more sort of interesting thing to be looking at, and sea state, perhaps, in previous Volvo Ocean Races and so on, and pre-foiling, it may not have been perhaps quite so relevant?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's getting a lot more relevant now. Yeah, it'd be fair to say in most of the ocean race stuff I've done, then it's never really been a big concern. You're much more concerned about the wind, and you just sort of deal with the sea state. But now it's a much bigger performance differentiator. So just trying to accurately, forecast and stay on top of that is going to be much more important than it has been to date. So yeah, it's something that I think, as a team, we're still learning about and trying to develop the best out of, and actually sort of learning from some of the old team guys and the stuff that they've done in the past is quite important. But it's actually interesting. You speak to the guys that did the Jules Verne on the big 140-foot bank pop Bel Air. There's now Spindrift. Now they weren't that concerned to sea state because the boat was so big. But it's probably more relevant for the Gitano that's going around now and Sotobo and this latest generation of old teams. I guess it's important as well.
That's interesting. So effectively, routes could be through more sort of conservative areas in these new boats than perhaps before. And we certainly saw in the Southern Ocean this year, the newer boats were sort of down at 12 to 15 knots at times. I don't think I've ever seen something like a Volvo 65 ever go that slowly in the Southern Ocean. But it was quite interesting. So that could become a feature, you think, for these new boats?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the routing is going to be interesting, as well as sea state. It's wind speed, and wind speed's always obviously very correlated to the sea state you get. But with these boats, you can be doing in excess of 20 knots in 16 knots of wind speed, so you don't really need 30 knots ever. So but whether you have the confidence to sail extra distance to be able to keep going faster or whatever, or it's it's low risk enough tactically, it'd be really interesting. But for sure, one thing that's going to be super important in crude racing, as we've seen in this race when they're single-handed, is just keeping the boat in one piece is absolutely critical. And I think certainly in the Southern Ocean, we've seen a lot of the front runners, like you say, we saw some quite low speeds, and I think it's really a case of, I think everyone was kind of saying, right, we just got to get through the Southern Ocean. Try not to break anything. Let's not push too hard, and then the real fight's going to be at the Atlantic. So I think we're sort of getting to the really exciting bit of the race.
Yeah. Now, just looking at the Southern Ocean, it's been fairly sort of unusual. Certainly, the Indian Ocean, we're dominated by these sort of high pressure systems that were pushing down on the ice line. Any thoughts, sort of climatologically, as to why it was quite a light, unusual system this time around? certainly compared to the Volvo Ocean Race that you guys had down in the south, which seemed pretty windy all the time.
Yeah, I'm not a super strong feeling either way. I think sometimes it's kind of just sort of luck of the draw and the conditions you get and where the fleet are. I mean, it was in, going back to ocean races, sort of 14, 15, the New Zealand round the horn and up to Brazil leg was actually really nice, and we sailed. It was very similar. We were sort of getting around high pressures, and it was very nice VMG sailing in sunny weather. Compare that to the last Volvo Ocean Race. It was, both the Southern Ocean legs were super windy, super hard, and there was really no way out of the low pressure train. So you just kind of had to keep pushing and keep pushing. So. But probably the nastier stuff is probably more typical, and if it's lighter, you kind of get a bit lucky. But
yeah. Let's have a quick look at what's to come. So I was just messing around with some graphics, just so we kind of explain to people what the sort of expectation is. So they're coming out of the corner of Brazil here, about to go through the doldrums, and then typically they'll be in this sort of straight line speed period of trade winds until they hook into the Azores High. Now the position of the Azores High is pretty critical in this section of the race, and it looks like when we look at the weather forecast that that position of that high is will allow the boats to perhaps take a more direct route through to France, rather than sort of doing this long route out and around. This was just a quick routing I did this morning. It's on a 2015 foiler rather than a latest generation foiler, but it just sort of gives you an indication that after they've got through the doldrums, it looks like they can take a fairly direct route back up. Is that generally because the Azores High is much further over to the African coast than it normally is?
yeah, I mean, it's generally that position of the Azores High is driven by what's happening by the weather in the Atlantic and the lows and highs that sort of transit across the Atlantic. So yeah, it's good. I think the interesting thing is, as the guys come up through the trades is how far east or west they're able to go, or even aim is going to be driven by what's happening with the weather up there in the North Atlantic. But actually, they won't arrive there for probably another week.
Let's have a quick look at the tracker, so this was the current situation. Just move that down a bit. The routing kind of favours them to come up a little bit for the doldrums crossing. Is that just so that they have a better angle coming out the other side?
Yeah, principally the routings, trying to sort of get a more favoured angle. And then actually, when I had a little look at it today as well, it sort of was a little bit dependent. And when you sort of routed through the fleet, how far east-west you went, kind of, was dictated by where the Azores Highs was and what the weather features further north were doing. So, yeah, I guess it's a challenge for them to sort of manage the short to medium term to sort of make the long term work, but not drive their short term thing by something that might or might not happen further down the track. But
yeah, it's really.
But it's quite interesting as well. I mean, they're quite right shifted the trade south of the equator, so they'll actually get a reasonably wide angle, which should make it easier for them to gain some easting. Get a bit more east to get a better angle in the trade winds once they get north of the equator. Obviously, the sort of caveat to that is generally when you're further west, the doldrums can be a bit easier, but the reality is they're actually quite west anyway, so maybe that's not such a big factor.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just run through the forecast. So this was at lunchtime today. It's lunchtime tomorrow, and then through into Sunday, Monday. Obviously, that's the end of the routing on windy, but looks pretty reasonable trade winds, and then this sort of kind of slab of high, this ridge, this sort of blocking ridge, gets sort of slowly pushed out the way by these sort of low pressures, one after the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to predict. I have to admit, I haven't had a detailed look at the what's going on at the sort of upper level 500 millibar stuff, just to see how fast moving these systems are. But yeah, I mean, you can see there's some big low pressures coming off of North America, and that's what sort of served to push, really squash the Azores high down. And then for that to re-establish, obviously these highs need to move out of the way, and some sort of high pressure system does need to work its way off the east coast of the States and sort of allow everything to re-establish. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. It's obviously sort of quite, we're into winter now, and those North Atlantic fronts extend a long way down as well. So that where we are in that frontal sequence and that pattern will dictate sort of what sort of weather they can get, and the reality is, it can really change quite quickly at the moment.
So that was Simon Fisher joining us from the handball. He's just back in the UK for a short time before preparing to go training in February back in the old Hugo Boss. On Monday, we're joined by Denny Hurro, who was race director for the Vendée Globe during the 2004-5 race, and I believe he did the 2008 race as well. So looking forward to catching up with him. Have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.